Now sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's story, which is Celtic Myth and Magic, a magical night of ancient Celtic tales. Tonight we're focusing on fairy lore and enchantments with an introduction to, or for some of you, a review of a few of the fairy beings. First up is the Cluricaunes. Now, Cluricaunes are a type of, and then we'll have stories afterwards. Cluricaunes are a type of otherworldly creature similar to the leprechaun. They've usually been seen sitting by the hearth of a fire and are always described as wearing a red jacket, a green high cap, and a feather sticking in it. Cluricaunes are small in stature and usually appear as wizened old men. Wizened, by the way, doesn't mean wise, it means shriveled up and dry, but I'm sure you knew that. They can do mischief, grant wishes, and poke fun at humankind. Sounds like some of the girls I met at Nancy's pub. Often confused with this other solitary fairies known as leprechauns or the Deargs. They prefer to be indoors and do not like to do any physical labor. Smart Cluricaunes, who does? They like any kind of alcoholic beverage and can be found in the cellars of rich men, helping themselves to whatever they fancy of wine and whiskey. We have the Banshee. The Banshee was a fairy woman who traditionally was a portent of death to certain families of Celtic descent. She appeared either as a small, shriveled old woman or else as a beautiful maiden with long, flaxen hair, which she constantly combed while keening loudly in an otherworldly voice. The Banshee is always seen alone and generally in a melancholy mood when found near the doomed person's home. Some people believe the Banshee was a ghost of a person who had suffered violence from some member of the family. In any event, she always repeats her keen from a particular place while announcing the approach of death to his descendants. Others believe the Banshee is a friendly spirit offering forewarning and guidance to the family. However, it is not certain whether she is a friend or an enemy to the chosen family to whom her warning is conveyed. Her cry often comes from a spring, a river, or lake in which her name is connected. The Merrow-Folk. The Merrow, some of my favorites. Deriving from the Gaelic word Murach, the Merrow is the Irish equivalent of mermaid and merman of other traditions. The Merrows beings are said to appear as human from the waist up, but have the body of a fish from the waist down. How inconvenient is that? They have a gentle, modest, affectionate, and benevolent disposition. There are other names pertaining to them in Gaelic: the Muirgelt, the Samcupa, the Mudrachakan, and the Suir, and others. They would seem to have been around for millennia, because according to the Bardic chroniclers, when the Milesians first landed on Irish shores, the Suir, or the sea nymphs, played around them on their passage. The Merrow were capable of attachment to human beings, and there are reports of them intermarrying and living among humans for many years. Hello, Eriador. However, they eventually return to their former homes beneath the sea. Merrow maidens are reputed to lure young men to follow them beneath the waves, where afterwards they live in an enchanted state. Merrows wear a special hat called a cohulin druth, which enables them to dive beneath the waves. If they lose this little red cap, it's said they have no power to return beneath the water. Sometimes they're said to leave their outer skins behind to assume others more magical and beautiful. The Merrow has soft white webs between her fingers. She is often seen with a comb parting her long green hair on either side. Merrow music is often heard coming from beneath the waves. An old tract found in the book of Lacan states that the king of the Fomorians, when sailing over the Ixian Sea, had been enchanted by the music of mermaids until he came within reach of these sirens, and then they tore his limbs asunder and scattered them on the sea. Well, again, reminds me of some of the girls I met at Nancy's pub. Let's see, Changelings. I had a strange dream about a changeling the other night. It was very disturbing, probably from watching too many YouTube videos. The Gaelic peasantry believed that certain otherworldly creatures kidnap some of their newborn babies, particularly those of good appearance, and exchange them with an old, emaciated, decrepit, and ugly fairy creature who was known as a changeling. Yep, that's the dream I had. The abducted children were not assumed to be dead, but living in a timeless fairy place exiled from the mortal realm. Sometimes a lactating woman was also abducted to suckle these kidnapped mortals, and sometimes to suckle fairy babies. Sometimes the changeling would procure a musical instrument such as a fiddle and play it wildly, forcing everyone in the house to dance against their will until exhaustion set in, and beyond. The changeling was, for obvious reasons, an unwelcome addition to any household. An attempt was always made at ejecting him. One method was to throw him across a fire. He would then vanish up the chimney, cursing all those he'd left behind. We have the Pooka. The Pooka is a type of Irish hobgoblin who can appear in many different shapes and forms. Usually he has red eyes and some sort of fire-breathing properties. He usually appears in the shape of a dark-colored large animal resembling a horse or a pony or even a very large goat. Sometimes the Pooka appears as a giant bull with eyes and nostrils gleaming fire. He's even been described as a very large eagle-like creature, such as the great winged roc of the legends of Sinbad and the Arabian Nights. The time of year particularly associated with the Pooka is Samhain, or Halloween, the last day of October. This is the time when the Celts believed the barriers between our material world and the other world to be at their weakest. The Pooka usually crept up silently behind his victim, and if he succeeded in getting his head between the victim's legs, they were whisked up upon his back, and then he could take his victim anywhere, to the highest peak, or the lowest depth, or to any place on the face of the earth. In Gaelic, the Pooka is sometimes called the Grugach, the hairy one. Many place names derived from the creature's name. In Cork, there are two places called Carragpooka, the Pooka's Rock. One is near Doneraile, and the other is near Macroom. More famously is Parapuka, the Pooka's Cavern in County Wicklow, which, of course, all this is not to be confused with the necklaces worn by those in the 70s, like David Cassidy and stuff. That's completely different. There's also a cairn, and a natural cave at Clopok, the name deriving from the Gaelic Clotha Pooka, meaning a stone of Pooka, in County Louth. There's also a Cluricaunes stone structure in Inishmore, the Aran Island off Galway coast, which is called Cluricaunes of Pooka. There's also a fair held every year in honor of the goat called Puck Fair at Kilgorlin, County Kerry. And then, of course, there's Puck from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, one of my very, very, very favorite characters. The Cassidys did have a good luck, Sharkeen, you're right. I mean, for the 70s and all. Lake dwellers. Nearly every lake in Ireland has a story or legend about underwater worlds in which hosts of the Sheerie live, occasionally rising above the waters to visit the mortals, to give aid, or even on some occasion to ask mortals for their aid. There are many legends about how the lakes in Ireland were formed, usually from magic underworld wells which rise up and fill the plains above. Related, of course, is the water Sheerie. The water Sheerie would be seen at twilight and night time as one crossed over the bogs. People described seeing a light bobbing up and down, which would lead unwary travelers astray if they followed it thinking it was another human being. Another name for it was, of course, the Jack-o'-lantern. The water Sheerie is related to the will-o'-the-wisp of British folklore. As one moved closer to the light, it would always move farther away so that it was impossible to catch up with it. More sea creatures would be the Roanes. The Roanes were the seal people of Ireland. They could shed their skins and live as humans for a while, but they had to return to the sea again. They're very gentle folk, and the women were renowned for their big brown eyes. Yes, I'm looking at you, Casey. In Scotland, they were known as Selkies, and there are many legends concerning them from the coastal areas of the Celtic lands. And then the fierce Peists. The Peists are supernatural lake-dwelling creatures, rather like the famous Nessie of Scotland. They've been sighted in modern times in lakes in Roscommon and other lakes around Ireland. Of course, they're notoriously difficult to verify, despite lake watches by enthusiasts and modern journalists. The Peists are described as being akin to giant conger eels, having the length of 7 yards and a thick body like a bull's, and a head with a mane on it like a horse's. But we all know what the Loch Ness monster looks like, don't we? In legends, they, as well as Nessie, guard treasures at the bottom of the lakes. So we've got a couple more here. Oh, the Dullahan. One of my favorites. The Dullahan is a headless rider on a black carriage called the Costa Bower, which was pulled by a number of black headless horses. Hard to get ahead in that game. It usually appeared as an omen of death to one of the more prosperous families in the region. Normally it had no sound as it passed by on the road, which is usually how one determined it was of an otherworldly character. What else we do? Oh, Far Dearg, one more. The Far Dearg, the red man, was a practical joker of the fairy realm. Far Dearg was always dressed in red, played many tricks upon unsuspecting mortals. He preferred to work alone. Sometimes he would come in to warm himself by a person's fire. Now pay attention to this, just in case you might need to know this. Sometimes he came in to warm himself by the fire, and if people of the house raised no objections to him, they prospered. But if anyone said any words against him, bad luck would happen to that person. Oh, then of course there is the... well, I guess there's many more, isn't there? But let's visit a few of these fine folk now in the following stories. Hello, Mr. Magic. In fact, let's start with a tale of the Far Dearg, the Red Man. This is called Teague of Lee. It was originally in a book by Thomas Crofton Croker, who collected it. Most of these stories were collected from oral tales. And Thomas Crofton Croker collected this in 1825 in his book Fairy Legends and Traditions. I can't stop in the house. I won't stop in it for all the money that's buried in the old castle of Carrigrone, if ever there was such a thing in the world, to be abused to my face, night and day, and nobody to the fore doing it. And then if I'm angry, to be laughed at with a great roaring ho, ho, ho. No, I won't stay in the house after tonight if there was not another place in the country to put my head under. Now this angry soliloquy was pronounced in the hall of the old manor house of Carrigrone by John Sheehan. John Sheehan was a new servant there. He had been only 3 days in the house, which had the character of being haunted, and in that short space of time he had been abused and laughed at by a voice which sounded as if a man spoke with his head in a cask. Nor could he discover who this was the speaker or from whence the voice came. No, I'll not stop here, said John, and that ends the matter there. Be quiet, John Sheehan, or else the worst will happen to you. John instantly ran to the hall window, as the words were evidently spoken by a person immediately outside, but no one was visible there. Much like my postman. That's a different story. He had scarcely placed his face at the pane of the glass when he heard another loud as if behind him in the hall. As quick as lightning, he turned his head, but no living thing was seen. John, shouted a voice that appeared to come from the lawn before the house. Do you think you'll see Teague? Oh, never, as long as you live. So leave alone looking after him and mind your own business, John Sheehan. There's plenty of company to dinner from Cork to be here today. And 'tis time you had the cloth laid. Oh, Lord bless us, there's more of it. I'll never stay another day here, repeated John. Hold your tongue and stay where you are quietly and play no tricks on Mr. Pratt as you did Mr. Jervius about the spoons. The spoons, how do you know about that? John Sheehan was confounded by this address from his invisible persecutor, but nevertheless he mustered courage enough to say, "Oh, who are you? Come here, let me see you if you're a man." But he received in reply only a laugh of unearthly derision. Goodbye. I'll watch you at dinner, John. I'll be watching you. Oh, Lord, but to us and all harm. This beats all. I'll watch you at dinner, is it? Maybe you will. 'Tis a broad daylight, so 'tis no ghost. But this is a terrible place, and this is the last day I'll stay in it. And how does he know about the spoons? If he tells it, I'm a ruined man. There was no living soul could tell it to him but Tim Barrett, and he's far enough off in the wilds of Botany Bay now. So how could he know it? I can't tell for all the world. But that's what I see there at the corner of the wall. 'Tis not a man. Oh, what a fool am I. 'Tis only this old stump of a tree. Ah, this is a shocking place, it is. Oh, I'll never stop in it, for I'll leave the house tomorrow. The very look of it's enough to frighten anyone. Not true. The mansion did have certainly an air of desolation. It was situated in a lawn, which had nothing to break its uniform level, save a few tufts of narcissuses, and there's a lot of S's in narcissuses, and a couple of old trees, coeval with the building. The house stood at a short distance from the road. It was upwards of a century old, and time was doing his work upon it. Its walls were weather-stained in all colors. Its roof showed various white patches. It had no look of comfort. All was dim and dingy without, and within there was an air of gloom, of departed and departing greatness, which harmonized well with the exterior. It required all the exuberance of youth and gaiety to remove the impression, almost amounting to awe, with which you trod upon the huge square hall, paced along the gallery which surrounded the hall, or explored the long rambling passages below those stairs. The ballroom, as the large drawing room was called, and several other apartments were in a state of decay. The walls were stained with damp, and, well, I remember well the sensations of awe which I felt creeping over me when, as a boy I was, and full of boyish life and wild ardent spirits, I descended down to the vaults. All without and within me became chilled beneath their dampness and gloom. Their extent, too, terrified me. Nor could the merriment of my two schoolfellows, whose father, a respectable clergyman, rented the dwelling for a time, dispel the feelings of romantic imagination that I had once, until I once again ascended up to the upper regions, at any rate. Now John had pretty well recovered himself as the dinner hour approached, and several guests arrived. They were all seated at the table, and had begun to enjoy the excellent repast, when a voice was heard from the lawn.
"Ho, ho, ho, Mr. Pratt, won't you give poor Teague some dinner?" A fine company you have there. Plenty of everything that's good. Sure you won't forget poor Teague. Surely you won't be forgetting poor Teague. Oh?
John dropped the glass he had in his hand. "Well, who's that?" said Mr. Pratt's brother, an officer of the artillery. "That is Teague," said Mr. Pratt, laughing, who must often have heard me mention Teague. "And pray, Mr. Pratt," inquired another gentleman, "who is this Teague?" "Oh, that," Mr. Pratt replied, "is more than I can tell you. No one has ever been able to catch a glimpse of him. I've been on watch for a whole evening with the three of my sons yet, although his voice sometimes sounded almost in my ear. I could not see him. I fancied, indeed, that I saw a man in a white frieze jacket pass into the door from the garden of the lawn, but it could be only fancy, for I found the door was locked. Well, the fellow, whoever he is, was laughing at our trouble. It just sneaks in without you even expecting him, just like a stranger. And he visits us occasionally. Sometimes a long interval passes between his visits, as in the present case. It's now nearly 2 years, since we heard that hollow voice outside the window." "Ah, yes. Well, Teague has never done any injury, that we know of, and once when he broke a plate, he brought one back exactly like it." "Well, that's very extraordinary," said several of the company. "Now, but," remarked a gentleman to young Mr. Pratt, "your father said he broke a plate. How'd he get at it without you seeing him?" "Well, when he asked for some dinner, we put it outside the window and go away. Well, as we watch, he'll not take it, but no sooner have we withdrawn than it's gone." "What did happen to him? How could it be that he do? How does he know you're watching him then?" "Well, that's more than I can tell you, too, but he either knows or suspects. One day my brothers Robert and James and myself were in our back parlour, which has a window into the garden, and when old Teague came in and said, 'Ho, ho, ho, Master James and Robert and Henry, give poor Teague a glass of whiskey,' James went out of the room, filled a glass with whiskey, vinegar, salt, and brought it to him. 'Here you go, Teague,' is he. 'Come for it now.' 'We'll put it down then outside the step outside the window,' he says. And this was done, and we stood looking at it. 'Well, there now, you all go away,' old Teague shouted. We retired, but we still watched. 'Oh, you're still watching, Teague. Go out of the room. Go now, or I won't be taking it,' he told us. So we went outside the doors and returned, and the glass was gone. And a moment after, we heard him roaring and cursing frightfully. He took away the glass, but the next day the glass was on the stone step under the window, and there were crumbs of bread inside, as if he had put it in his pocket. And from that time he has not heard. Well, Not till today, at any rate. Oh, well, said the colonel. I'll be getting a sight of him, I will. You're not used to these things. An old soldier such as me has the best chance. And I shall finish my dinner with this wing here. I'll be ready for him when he speaks. Next, Mr. Bell, will you be taking a glass of wine with me then? Ho, 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 Mr. Bell, shouted Teague. Ho, 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 ho. Mr. Bell, is it? You were a Quaker long ago. Ho, 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 Mr. Bell, you're a pretty boy, aren't you? A pretty Quaker you were. And now you're no Quaker nor anything else. Ho, 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 ho. Mr. Bell, it is. Oh, there's Mr. Parks, to be sure. Mr. Parks looks like a mighty fine today, doesn't he, eh? With his powdered head, his grand silk stockings, his brand new rakish red waistcoat. Oh, there's Mr. Cole. Did you ever see such a fellow as Mr. Cole? A pretty company you brought together, Mr. Pratt. Kiln-dried Quakers, butter-buying buckeens from Mallow Lane, and a drinking excise-men from the Cold Key. Oh, to meet the great thunder and artillery general that's come out of the Indies. It's the biggest dust of you all. Why, you scoundrel! Exclaimed the colonel. I'll make you show yourself. And snatching up his sword from a corner of the room, he sprang out of the window upon the lawn. In a moment, a shout of laughter so hollow, so unlike any human sound, made him stop, as well as Mr. Bell, who was with a huge oak stick, was close at the colonel's heels, and others of the party followed on the lawn, and the remainder rose and went to the windows. Come on, Colonel, said Mr. Bell. Let us catch this impudent rascal. This far Dearg as it is. Is that what you'd be calling it? Mr. Bell, here I am. Here's Teague, you red man. Why don't you catch him? Colonel Pratt, what a pretty soldier you are to be drawing your sword upon poor Teague that never did anybody harm. Let us see your face, you scoundrel, said Colonel. Oh, look at me, do you see the wind, Colonel Pratt? You'll see Teague as soon. So go in and finish your dinner now. If you're upon this earth, I will find you, you villain, said the colonel, whilst the same unearthly shout of derision seemed to come from behind an angle of the building. He's round that quarter, Mr. Bell. Run, run! They followed the sound, which was continued at intervals along the garden wall, but could discover no human being. At last both stopped to draw breath, and in an instant, almost at their ears, sounded a shout. Oh, Colonel Pratt, do you see Teague now? Do you hear him? You are a fine colonel to be following the wind. Not that way, Mr. Bell, not that way. Come here, said the colonel. What a fool you are. Do you think Teague is going to show himself to you in the field there? But Colonel, follow me if you can. And you a soldier? The colonel was enraged. He followed the voice over the hedge and ditch, and alternately laughed at and taunted by the unseen object of his pursuit. Mr. Bell, who was heavy, was soon thrown out, until at length, after being led a weary chase, he found himself at the top of the cliff over that part of the River Lee, which from its great depth and the blackness of its waters has received the name of Hell-hole. And here on the edge of the cliff stood the colonel out of breath, mopping his forehead with his handkerchief, while the voice, Teague, which seemed close at his feet, exclaimed, "And now, Colonel Pratt, now if you are a soldier, here's a leap for you. Now look at Teague. Why don't you look at him? Come along. You're warm, I'm sure, Colonel Pratt. So come in and cool yourself in the water, why don't you? Teague's going to have a swim." The voice seemed as descending amongst the trailing ivy and brushwood which disclosed this picturesque cliff nearly from top to bottom. Yet it was impossible that any human being could have found footing.
Well, Colonel, have you the courage to take the leap, soldier boy? What a pretty soldier you are. Goodbye, Colonel, goodbye. I'll see you again in 10 minutes above at the house. Look at your watch, Colonel. There's a dive for you.
And a heavy plunge into the water was heard, and the colonel stood still, but no sound followed, and he walked slowly back to the house, not quite half a mile from the crag. Well, did you see that Teague thing, then? Said his brother, whilst his nephew, scarcely able to smother their laughter, stood by. Give me some wine, said the colonel. I never was led such a dance in all my life, and the fellow carried me all round and round until he brought me to the edge of the cliff, and then down he went into the hell-hole, telling me he'd be here, right here. In 10 minutes, no less. 'Tis more than that now, but he's not come. He's not here, is he?
Is he not, Colonel? Oh, yes, Teague never told a lie in his life. But, Mr. Pratt, give me a drink and my dinner, and then good night to you all, for I'm tired. That's the Colonel's doing, isn't it?
A plate of food was ordered. It was placed by John, with fear and trembling, on the lawn under the window. Everyone kept on the watch, and the plate remained undisturbed for some time.
Mr. Pratt, will you starve poor Teague? Make everyone go away from the window, and Master Henry out of the tree. I see you. And Master Richard off the garden wall. Go! Begone! I'm hungry, and I'll have my dinner now.
The eyes of the company were turned to the tree and the garden wall. The two boys' attention was occupied in getting down. The visitors were looking at them, and...
Good luck to you, Mr. Pratt. Yeah, 'tis a good dinner. And there's the plate, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye to you, Colonel. Goodbye, Mr. Bell. Goodbye. Goodbye to you all.
And Teague's voice was heard no more for that evening. Many visits afterwards were paid by Teague, but never was he seen, nor was any discovery ever made of his person or character. So there's the far Dearg, the red man. I don't think I want to be haunted by one of those. Doesn't seem particularly damaging, but damned annoying. Who else did we talk about? Oh, we started with the Cluricaunes, didn't we? Let's do Story of the Cluricaunes. This one is from a book called Magic and Mythology, 1819, I think. Another one of the old ones. Anyway, it's Paddy O'Byrne and the Devil's Glen. Now, Paddy O'Byrne was what was known as a gentleman farmer, and he had been sent to Trinity College in Dublin in his younger days to receive a training in the classics, and he knew Greek and Greek, but not English. Received a training in the classics, and he knew Greek and Latin. He returned to his farm in County Wicklow near Roundwood, and lived in comfort on his acres in the selling and buying of livestock. He was a bachelor and was now getting on in years. People around called him Gentleman Paddy behind his back, as he loved to bend their ears with his monologues and obscure Greek verse and Latin, just to show off how educated and erudite he considered himself to be above others. Now, you see, Paddy O'Byrne suffered from the fault of pride, believing that he was a cut above everyone else, which is why he had never gotten married, thinking that solid country girls were not good enough for him. He was ever the dapper gentleman, preferring to spend his money on himself and his wardrobe. Now it happened that one evening, as Gentleman Paddy was returning from the fair in a semi-intoxicated state, having had one too many malt whiskies. Of course, how many really is too many, but in any rate, he decided to take a shortcut to his home by the way of the Devil's Glen. For he was not afraid of the stories that abounded about ghostly sightings and fairy folk and such nonsense as that. Now, that's not to be confused with the Kelora Glen. No, This was the Devil's Glen. As he walked along, he held a soliloquy aloud in which he wondered would he ever marry, and deciding that Miss Kathleen O'Toole was too homely and not well read enough for him, he wondered about any fine city ladies deigned to marry him, and deciding they would not be good at farm management, he really had no choice but to remain a bachelor. So when above Paddy in the forest he heard a rustling, and Gentleman Paddy, looking upwards, perceived a diminutive little creature astride on one of the oak boughs that stretched across the roadway. Now this little creature was dressed in a uniform of green and gold, with a black military cocked hat and a pendant white feather falling over one of its brims. This little fellow wore a red vest, while his white shorts and silk stockings, with nice little dancing sharp-toed pumps, fronted with gold clasps and buckles, nearly completed his costume. A pair of spurs was fastened upon his heels. The extremities of this little guy's nose and chin seemed almost hooked together, while his mouth formed a crossing of two irregular rubied lines through which long yellowish-white teeth glittered, and his face was covered over with wrinkles or crow's feet meeting at every conceivable angle. His eyes glittered like diamonds, and this time he gave a loud laugh, but in the fairy's peculiar shrill key. "Good night, Mr. O'Byrne," he cried at last. "I am right glad to have the pleasure of meeting you in this lonely glen, as you are. You are an amusing character, aren't you? To form your acquaintance even now, sir, for as you know the old saying, better late than never." The individual addressed trembled from head to foot, that being Paddy O'Byrne, and when he got a full glimpse of the goblin, and notwithstanding that he was almost paralyzed with fear when hearing these words, Mr. O'Byrne endeavored to muster sufficient courage for another colloquy, which he knew to be inevitable. Making low obeisance to the little man, not more than a few palms in stature, the mortal faltered out this return of salute with a forced cough to conceal his own nervousness and embarrassment. "Sir, I'm exceedingly obliged for your kind good wishes, my dear sir. Maybe I should call you your Royal Highness, or your Grace, or at least my lord, for you seem by your rich accoutrements then to hold some high military rank in the army, eh? Maybe you're a captain or a major or a general. I ought to style ye, but you'll be kind enough to correct me, your Royal Highness. If I make a mistake, might I beg, as a favour, a knowledge of the title by which your Excellency is known?" "Oh, I am called the Cluricaunes." "Aye, a highly respectable class of the good people you belong to, then," chimed in Mr. O'Byrne, with the oil of flattery on his tongue. "Indeed, it's well known that you are full of talent, are you not? And fond of women frolicking wherever you happen to be. As for myself, I have a turn for fun and humour too, like most Irishmen, I do." "Oh, I'm very glad to hear that." "You were in a great glee a while ago, weren't you?" returned the Cluricaunes. "But I mean to show off in a few entertainments tonight, if you have no objection, Mr. O'Byrne." "Well, not in the least in life, your Royal Highness," said the mortal. "Well then, Mr. O'Byrne, would you like to hear a little of my mind about you, or about your perfections and your accomplishments?" said the Cluricaunes with a laugh. "Well, that'll be a great pleasure, your Excellency," returned the personage addressed, yet with some hesitation. "Oh, really? Well, do you want to hear the naked truth, sir?" "Aye, the truth indeed I do, your worship, especially from a highly and intelligent gentleman like yourself." Well, you yourself are neither drunk nor sober precisely at this present moment, are you, Mr. O'Byrne? But maybe you'll understand the first of my remarks to you on another subject." "Indeed, your Excellency, I would not say, but I am slightly elevated, sure enough. Yet, on my word and honour, I did not take too much." "Well, the very next thing to it, eh? You took more than was good for your health or your mind or body. Again, to be plain with you, I must declare that you, sir, are full of self-conceit." "Well, I did not suppose I was, your Excellency." "Well, that is the case with every really conceited man, isn't it?" cried the Cluricaunes. "Why, your Excellency would know best, and I won't dispute the question with ye." What pretensions, sir, could you possibly have to a seat in Parliament or to a position at the bar?
Oh, well, none whatever, Your Excellency. Only my natural talent and education might procure some distinctions for me, if I had more means, a greater landed property, or I might be helped there by an illustrious patron like yourself, who is known to have vast treasures at your command. Is that not true? Well, Mr. Byrne, if I have vast treasures, be right sure I would not be bestowing any of me money upon you, for you do not deserve any patronage from me. What are your ideas about politics? Huh. Well, might I ask, Your Excellency, whether you belong to the Liberal or the Tory party?
Oh, then I presume you would like to fall in with my opinion on public questions, hmm?
Well, I would suppose your worship ought to be a good judge about the wants and interests of the country, as you can see things more clearly and intelligently than we mortals can.
But I would like to act the part of a good patriot and an Irishman on all occasions and under all circumstances. Ah, ah! I often heard the same thing said by many a humbug in times ever. But I must say, Mr. O'Byrne, you are neither one nor the other, for you honestly act up to your political convictions and principles. Moreover, I think every man should have the public spirit to forward a good cause according to the best of his abilities. Besides, you could make very excellent speeches, Mr. O'Byrne, if you were not so fond of alluding to yourself. A theme on which every fool is most eloquent. But what, sir, have you to boast of in composing your wretched charades, rebuses, and enigmas? These can hardly be regarded as intellectual exercises. They only occupy the attention of small wits or idle persons, sir. Any hedge schoolmaster can do as much, and to compare yourself as a poet with Tom Moore. Well, to be sure, Mr. O'Byrne, is that not the height of impertinence?
Poor gentleman Paddy hung down his head, and seemed rather confused as he discovered all his soliloquies had been overheard by the Cluricaunes. The latter recommenced his invectives.
And now, Mr. O'Byrne, you also spoke slightingly about one Miss Kathleen O'Toole, and you thought she would not make a sufficiently good wife for you, because she does not indulge in any of your pedantry and nonsense. Yet I can tell you she comes from as good a family and stock as your own, sir, in the county of Wicklow. Aye, Kathleen O'Toole has a fortune that no comfortable farmer should despise. Kathleen O'Toole is better looking and younger than you by far. She's at least as careful and neat a housekeeper indoors as you are a proper manager outside. She has sobriety and modesty, in both of which respects you are somewhat deficient. Kathleen O'Toole excels you greatly in every other fair quality. Shame, shame upon you! You should overrate the showy, fashion-loving, dressy, talkative ladies of Dublin, and overlook the sterling character and good looks of an honest and simple but decent, respectable Wicklow farmer's daughter. Bah! Maybe then, Mr. O'Byrne, you will never meet with a half as good a match as all the dear days of your life. Ah!
Now, Mr. O'Byrne keenly felt all those just reproaches, for he had suspected as much himself, but he tried to appear as complacent and repentant as possible. He also wished to keep up his spirits and show no signs of fear in the company of the Cluricaunes. This, however, cost him a great effort, for he was really anxious and uneasy to understand the sprite's object. The Cluricaunes began again.
And, Mr. O'Byrne, for our special amusement, I would now like to indulge in a little fun and to play off a few pranks in your presence, sir.
Well, Your Highness, I'm very fond of sport, and he is a churl that is not, so the moment you're ready to commence the fun, I'll enjoy it beyond measure. Mr. O'Byrne found his stomach to be slightly upset at this point.
Maybe then, Mr. O'Byrne, you'll soon laugh at the wrong side of your mouth, for in truth I'm convinced already you would sooner have my room than my company. Now, look out, stop a moment, and you'll see what I can do.
And with that, the little man began to swing with both his arms from a crossbow, like a leotard from the trapeze, and then, with incredible speed and dexterity, cast himself by a series of somersaults from one branch to another. Before the gaze, an alarmed, astonished mortal. When somewhat tired of this exercise, the Cluricaunes looked below, and thus continued.
So what do you make of that performance, Mr. O'Byrne? Did you ever witness anything like it? Now, Gentleman Paddy mentally acknowledged it was extraordinary enough, and most sincerely hoped he might never have a repetition of any similar performance under similar circumstances. But as he must reply to the question, he at last faltered, I've not seen the likewill of that, then, certainly, your high mightiness. Although I saw Mr. Merriman turn many an active head over heels on the stage in the front of the show box at the Fair of Wicklow. Why, you compare me with that paint-daubed harlequin, said the Cluricaunes. Do you think you're paying me a compliment, or is it the language one gentleman should use to another? Can you whistle, Mr. O'Byrne? Well, whistle will only very differently, I apprehend, for your Excellency's musical ear, but sometimes I do. So now is there any particular tune your honour wishes me to whistle? Do you know Tatterjack Walsh? Says the sprite. It's a great favourite of mine. Well, I do, replied Mr. O'Byrne. It's a very sprightly tune, actually, when given in quick time. Why then, Mr. O'Byrne, give it in quick time, cried the Cluricaunes, without a moment's delay. An admonition which Mr. O'Byrne instantly complied with, and setting his lips in order, he proceeded to render it in his best possible style and in the clearest and liveliest strains. And no sooner had he whistled the first bar than the Cluricaunes, curling over and over with a quick and almost instantaneous rotary motion through the air, alighted with his dancing pups on the crown of Mr. O'Byrne's new Caroline hat. At once the nimble atomy figure commenced pattering with his heel and toe to the sound of the music. He strained his knees, and he threw upwards his tiny legs like a pasteboard toy moved with strings. He cracked his fingers as an accompaniment, and in the glee of his soul he sometimes emitted an ejaculation of delight in a whoop whoo hurrah hurrah bravo hoo 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 bravo hoo hoo. Every treble step and flourish sent the hat down more firmly over the eyebrows of Mr. O'Byrne, and the noise made on the crown of his prize Caroline was like that of a hen egg hailstones rattling on a slate roof. Oh, for the love of goodness and justice, your honour, don't be spoiling my brand new Caroline hat that I paid 15 shillings for last week in Dublin. It's the only decent one I have to appear in on Sunday or holiday or meeting or wedding or christening or fair or market. Hold your tongue, sir, replied the Cluricaunes, and keep up the tune until I finish the jig. If you don't, it'll be the worse for you. So with a heavy heart and an agitated vocalism, Mr. O'Byrne resumed the tune until the Cluricaunes had finished the last beat with his feet. He then jumped off a perch or so on the path before the mortal, and first standing on his head, the sprite made one spring upwards. His feet were locked together over another oak bough, with his head hanging down and a sardonic grin upon his face. Don't you stir an inch from where you are, Mr. O'Byrne, until I make another proposal to ye. Are you not proud of your wrestling, of which you are not now boasting? I would like in this very spot to see what stuff you're made of, Mr. O'Byrne, and I now wish to try a fall with ye. Aye, well, your honour, I've not wrestled a fall this many days, nor can I presume to try one with your mightiness, who is so young and active. Indeed, sir, I grant you'd soon turn the soles of my boots to the moonlight if I try. No matter for that. You must now do what you can. And mind if I throw you a toll, it'll be over that ledge of rock, and maybe you'll tumble down into the very waters of the Vartree. So now, Mr. O'Byrne, do your best. With that, he jumped on the ground, once more alighting on his feet. He seized Mr. O'Byrne's whip, which he threw to one side, and then took him by the collar and elbow. Both pulled and strained for the bare life, and now and then the mortal received a sore tip on the shin from the Cluricaunes' spur, while his very antagonist wriggled his legs out of the way when a hook or trip was intended. After a considerable share of tugging and prancing about, the Cluricaunes at last took Mr. O'Byrne at a disadvantage, touched him under the knee joint, whipped the right foot upwards, and then with a slight toss sent him right over the precipice. A heavy fall was the result, and the contest was at an end. And now then, maybe I've taken the conceit out of ye a bit. Cried the Cluricaunes, while Mr. O'Byrne rubbed down his side and shoulder, which had come in contact with some sharp rocks and roots on the surface. Then the vanquished man acknowledged, as he was fairly thrown, he was again helped upon his feet. The sprite even extended his hand to pull his adversary once more up the bank, And there at last Mr. O'Byrne, sore and jaded, stood after his late trial of strength. And no sooner had Gentleman Paddy fairly recovered from the first effects of this shock when the little fairy was resolved to put him under another ordeal. Taking up the whip, after a sudden step or two backwards with a short run, he vaulted upon Mr. O'Byrne's back, and then flourishing the whip, he gave a smart tap and cried out, "Come now, Mr. O'Byrne, come now! Trot out in good style, for it's getting rather advanced in the night, and I want to ride upon your back to the upper part of Devil's Glen. Then I'll leave you at the waterfall." Step out, said. Step out, step out, step out, he repeated, redoubling his strokes, with an occasional touch of the spur, and the mortal was obliged to quicken his paces over the course indicated, which lay also in the direction of his own home. "Oh, would your worship sit more lightly on my back, please, and keep your knees closer on my ribs, and you'll find there'll be no need of a whip or a spur to keep me moving as fast as I can." See, that's where the spurs come in. "For upon your honour and conscience, I am tired and sore enough after the day's exercise and getting home from the fair, not to speak of the hard tussle I had with your honour just now. If your worship pleases, I'll move on quickly, without the necessity of your using the whip or the spurs. Did you ever hear the old proverb, Mr. Patrick O'Byrne?" "Hoo! Move out, move out!" "Mr. O'Byrne, the old proverb that a spur in the head is worth two on the heel," rejoined the Cluricaunes. Gentleman Paddy's conscience misgave him on remembering these potations he had indulged at the fair of Wicklow, and he was at a loss for an answer. At last he ventured to remark, "Well then, your honour, in that case, without your two spurs on the heel, my spur in the head ought to be enough to satisfy your excellency that will get over the ground before us in very good time." "Oh, well then, tell the truth, Mr. O'Byrne. Didn't you get more than a spur in your head today before you left the fair green, "Well, there's no use in hiding anything from your honour, even if I were deposed, and I must say, I did take a second tumbler of punch at Michael Murphy's hotel, I did, on the head of our bargain." "And anything else?" "Well, just a dandy of a skelteen by way of Duke and Durras before I got a seat with my good friend Mr. Hennessy, who offered me the accommodations of his outside jaunting car." "Aye, then you ought to be pretty well. I thank you, as they say in this part of the country, and I don't think you took a little too much for your light head in the addled brains this blessed moonlit night." I'm very sure I did, since your honour says it then." Mr. O'Byrne penitently gasped and panted as he perspired and reeled under the weight of his unrelenting rider. At last, with much effort, both reached the top of the glen, where the waterfall's loud roar was distinctly heard. The Cluricaunes thereupon relaxed his hold. Leaping off of Mr. O'Byrne's back, he cried out, "Here then, I'll leave you, Mr. O'Byrne, and a bid of good-bye to ye. But take my advice for the future, Mind how you stray about the Devil's Glen after dark, with nothing but the glasses of punch and your own wee small wits to guide ye. Or maybe you'll have a repetition of the pretty hard usage you received tonight for your correction and improvement." With that, drawing out his tiny foot, he gave Mr. O'Byrne a kick which sent him clear across the waterfall. This blow completely stunned him, and he felt as if the huckle bone of his hip were out of joint after such rough treatment, in addition to his previous mishaps. In the morning early, Mr. O'Byrne was found by one of his neighbours and snoring upon the ground at the bottom of the ravine, apparently unconscious of the exposed quarters in which his lodging had been taken. His new Caroline hat was battered on leaf and crown. His blue coat and pantaloons were soiled with mud. His face was scraped, his body stiff and sore. He told the story of what had occurred and attributed his misfortunes to the ill-timed, practical jokes of the mischief-loving Cluricaunes. And after that, Paddy O'Byrne never ventured alone into the Devil's Glen, and was much more moderate in all things. Indeed, people remarked on the change in him from that time onwards. Oh, the Cluricaunes sounds like a delightful little creature, doesn't he? I think we have 4 minutes on the clock and 8 minutes in the story. So, we're going to push ahead. I hope you can stay with us. This is a tale of the Merrow-Folk by Andrew Lang, who wrote all those cool different colored fairy books. Also the 1820s, 1825, I believe. This one's called The Wonderful Tune. Indeed, Maya, I think you're correct about that. Well, I don't know. Did you mean Mr. O'Byrne or the Cluricaunes? Yeah. Anyway, The Wonderful Tune. Maurice Connor was the king, and that's no small word. He was the king of all the pipers in Munster. He could play jig and planxty without end, and Olesham's march, and the eagle's whistle, and the hen's concert, and odd tunes of every sort. But he knew one far more surprising than the rest, which had it in its power to set everything dead or alive dancing. In what way he learned it is beyond my knowledge, for he was a mighty cautious about telling how he came by so wonderful a tune. At the very first note of that tune, the brogues began shaking upon the feet of all who heard. Old or young, it mattered not, just as if their brogues had the ague, and the feet began going from under them, and last up and away with them, dancing like mad, whisking here and there and everywhere like a straw in a storm. There was no halting while that music lasted. Not a fair, nor a wedding, nor a patron in the 7 parishes round was counted worth the speaking of without blind Maurice and his pipes. His mother, poor woman, used to lead him about from one place to another, just like a dog. Down through Vera, a place that ought to be proud of itself, for 'tis Daniel O'Connell's country, Maurice Connor and his mother were taking their rounds beyond all other places. Vera is the place of a stormy coast and steep mountains. As proper a spot it is in Ireland to get yourself drowned or your neck broken on the land, should you prefer that. But notwithstanding, in Ballinskellig lay there is a neat bit of ground, well fitted for diversion, and down from it towards the water is a clean, smooth piece of strand, the dead image of a calm summer's sea on a moonlit night, with just the curl of the small waves upon it. Ballinskellig Bay. And here it was, that Maurice's music had brought from all parts a great gathering of the young men and women, oh, the darlings, for it was not every day the strand of Trafarska was stirred up by the voice of a bagpipe. The dance began. It was a pretty rinkafada which was ever danced. Brave music, said everybody, and well done when Maurice stopped. More power to your elbow, Maurice, and a fair wind in the bellows, cried Paddy Dorman. A humpbacked dancing master was there to keep order. 'Tis a pity, said he. If we'd let the piper run dry after such music, 'twould be a disgrace to Ivara, and that didn't come on since a week of the 3 Sundays. And so as well became him, for he was always a decent man, says he. Did you drink, piper? Well, I will, sir, says Maurice, answering the question on the safe side, for you never yet knew a piper or schoolmaster refused his drink. What will you drink be, then, Maurice? Says Paddy. Well, I'm no ways particular about that, says Maurice. I drink anything and give God thanks better than raw water. And if 'tis all the same to you, Mr. Dorman, maybe you wouldn't lend me the loan of a glass of whiskey. I've no glass, Maurice, said Paddy. I've only the bottle. Well, let that be no hindrance for you, then, answered Maurice. My mouth just holds a glass to the drop. Often I've tried it, sure. So Paddy Dorman trusted him with the bottle, more fool was he, and to his cost he found that although Maurice's mouth might not hold more than the glass at one time, yet owing to the hole in his throat it took many a filling. That was no bad whiskey neither, says Maurice, handing back the empty bottle. By holy frost, then, says Paddy. 'Tis but a cold comfort there's in that bottle now, and 'tis your word we must take for the strength of the whiskey, for you've left us no sample to judge by. And to be sure, Maurice had not. No, I need not tell you, any gentleman or lady with common understanding, that if he or she was to drink an honest bottle of whiskey at one pull, it is not at all the same thing as drinking a bottle of water. And in all the whole course of my life, I never knew more than 5 men who could do so without being overtaken by the liquor. Of these, Maurice Connor was not one. And though he had a stiff head enough of his own, he was fairly tipsy, shall we say. Well, don't think I blame him for it. 'Tis often a good man's case. But true is the word that says, when liquor's in, the sense is out. And puff, out of breath, before you could say, Lord save us all, out blasted Maurice Connor's wonderful tune. 'Twas really beyond all belief then, or telling the dancing. Maurice himself could not keep quiet, staggering now on one leg and now on the other, rolling about like a ship in the cross sea, trying to humor the tune. There was his mother, too, moving her old bones as light as the youngest girl of them all. But her dancing, no, nor the dancing of all the rest, is not worthy the speaking about to the work that was going on down upon the strand at the side of the sea. Every inch of it was covered with all manner of fish, jumping and plunging about to the music, and every moment more and more would tumble in out of the water, charmed by that wonderful tune. Crabs of monstrous size spun around and around and around on one claw with the timbleness of a dancing master, and whirled and tossed their other claws like limbs that did not belong to them. It was a surprising sight to see. But perhaps you have heard of Father Florence Conry, a Franciscan friar and a great Irish poet, Borgandana, they used to call him, a wallet of poems. If you have not, he was as pleasant a man as one would wish to drink with of a hot summer's day, and he has rhymed out all about the dancing fishes so neatly that it would be 1,000 pities not to give you his verses. And so, here's my hand, and an upset of them into English. The big seals in motion, like waves of the ocean, our gouty feet prancing, came heading the gay fish, crabs and lobsters and crayfish, determined on dancing. The sweet sounds they followed, the gasping cod swallowed, it was wonderful, really. And turbot and flounder, mid fish that were rounder, just capered as gaily. John Dories came tripping, Dullahan brothers skipping, to frisk them seen given, bright barnacle went springing, like small rainbows winging their flight up to heaven. The whiting and haddock left saltwater paddock, this dance to be put in, were skate with flat faces, edged out some odd places, but their souls kept their footing. Sprats and herrings in power of silvery shower, all numbered, outnumbered, a great length so lengthy, were there in such plenty, the shore was encumbered. The scallop and oyster with their 2 shells did roister, like castanets fitting, while limpets moved clearly, and rocks rarely nearing, where laughter was splitting. Well, perhaps I don't give it as good a rendition as the father did, but never was there such an hullabaloo in all this world before or since. 'Twas as if heaven and earth were coming together, and all out of Maurice Connor's wonderful tune. In the height of all these doings, what should there be dancing among the outlandish set of fishes but a beautiful young woman, as beautiful as the dawn of the day. She had a cocked hat upon her head. From under it her long green hair, yes, green, just as the color of the sea, fell down behind, without hindrance to her dancing. Her teeth were like rows of pearls, her lips for all the world like red coral, and she had an elegant gown as white as the foam of the wave, with little rows of purple and red seaweed settled upon it. For you never yet saw a lady, under the water or over the water, who had not a good notion of dressing herself out. And up she danced, at last, to Maurice, who was flinging his feet from under him as fast as hops, for nothing in the world could keep still while that tune of his was going on, and she says to him, chaunting it out with a voice as sweet as honey, I'm a lady of honor who live in the sea. Come down, Maurice Connor, and be married to me. Silver plates and gold dishes you shall have and shall be the king of the fishes when you're married to me. Now drink was strong in Maurice's head, and out he chaunted in return for her great civility, as not every lady, maybe, that would be after making such an offer to a blind piper. Therefore it was only right in him to give her as good as she gave herself. So says Maurice, Well, I'm obliged to you, madam, of a gold dish or plate. If a king and I had 'em, I could dine in great state. With your own father's daughter I'd be sure to agree, but to drink the salt water, wouldn't do so with me. The lady looked at him quite amazed, and swinging her head from side to side like a great scholar. Well, says she, Maurice, if you're not a poet, where is poetry to be found? In this way they kept on it, framing high compliments, one answering the other, and their feet going with the music as fast as their tongues. All the fish kept dancing too. Maurice heard the clatter, was afraid to stop dancing lest it might be displeasing to the fish, and not knowing what so many of them may take it into their heads to do if they got vexed at him. Well, the lady with the green hair kept on coaxing of Maurice with her soft speeches, till at last she overpersuaded him to promise to marry her, and be king over the fishes, great and small. Maurice was well fitted to be their king. If they wanted one that could make them dance, and surely he would drink, barring the salt water, with any fish of them all. Now, when Maurice's mother saw him, with that unnatural thing in the form of a green-haired lady as his guide, and he and she dancing together so lovingly to the water's edge through the thick of the fishes, she called out after him to stop and come back. "Okay, then," says she, "as if I was not widow enough before. There he is, going away from me to be married to that scaly woman, and who knows but 'tis a grandmother I may be to a hake or a cod. Ah, Lord help and pity me, but 'tis mighty unnatural thing. Maybe 'tis boiling and eating my own grandchildren I'll be with a bit of salt and butter, and I not known it. Oh, Maurice, Maurice, my son, if there's any love or nature left in ye, come back to your old mother, who reared you like a decent Christian." Then the poor woman began to cry and oolagon so finely that it would do any one good to hear. Now, Maurice was not long getting to the rim of the water, and there he kept playing and dancing on as if nothing was the matter, and a great thundering wave coming in towards him, ready to swallow him up alive. But as he could not see it, he did not fear it. His mother it was who saw it plainly through the big tears that were rolling down her cheeks, and though she saw it, and her heart was aching as much as ever a mother's heart ached for her son, she kept dancing and dancing all the time for the bare life of her. Certain it was she could not help it, for Maurice never stopped playing that wonderful tune of his. He only turned the bothered ear to the sound of his mother's voice, fearing it might put him out in his steps, and all the answer he made back was, "Wisht with you, mother. I'm sure I'm going to be the king of the fishes down in the sea, and for a token of luck and a sign that I'm alive and well, I'll send you, darling mother. Every 12-month I'll send you on this day a piece of burned wood to Trafraska." Now Maurice had not the power to say the word more, for the strange lady with the green hair, seeing the wave just upon them, covered him up with herself in a thing like a cloak with a big hood to it. The wave, curling over twice as high as their heads, burst upon the strand with a rush and a roar that might be heard as far as Cape Clear. And that day, that very day, 12-month, the piece of burned wood came ashore in Trafraska. Now, it was a queer thing for Maurice to think of sending all the way from the bottom of the sea. A gown or a pair of shoes would have been something like a present for his poor mother, but he had said it and he kept his word. The bit of burned wood regularly came ashore on the appointed day for as good, aye, and better than 100 years. Well, the day is now forgotten, and maybe that is the reason why people say how Maurice Connor has stopped sending the luck token to his mother. The poor woman, she did not live to get as much as one of them, for what through the loss of Maurice and the fear of eating her own grandchildren in salt and butter, she died 3 weeks after the dance, some saying it was the fatigue that killed her, but whichever it was, Mrs. Connor was decently buried with her own people. I know, seafaring men have often heard off the coast of Kerry, on a still night, the sound of music coming up from the water, and some who have good ears could plainly distinguish Maurice Connor's voice singing these words to his pipes. "Beautiful shore with thy spreading strand, the crystal water and diamond sand, never would I have parted from thee, but for the sake of my fair lady." Okay then, so we're over the hour, and thank you for staying with us for the wonderful tune of Maurice Connor.